The Witcher series, one of the most successful video game series ever released, with over 75 million copies sold, where 50 million of those was just for The Witcher 3. Heck, they even ported it to the Nintendo Switch. About 2 months ago, I thought I'd revisit the Witcher trilogy and play the games how they were originally experienced, and to do that, I would have to match as closely as I could the recommended system requirements per game, which resulted in these 3 builds here. With that out the way, let's take a look at The Witcher 1 with this PC build right here. The Witcher was released in 2007 by CD Projekt Red and published by Atari. So let's start by looking at the minimum system requirements for the game, which you're currently seeing on screen. I'm not seeing anything over the top here. From a CPU perspective, you would have needed an Intel P4 running at 2.4 GHz or an AMD Athlon 64, the plus 2800 version. From a RAM perspective, you needed at least 1 gig of RAM, and from a GPU perspective, you needed a minimum of 128 megs of VRAM and a NVIDIA GeForce 6600 or above, or the ATI Radeon 9800. Now both these GPUs were released, the 6600 in 2004 and the 9800 in 2003, so these GPUs would have already been a good 3-4 years old by the time this game was released. Let's now take a look at the recommended system requirements. Starting with the CPUs, they've upped the Pentium 4 now to 3 GHz, and for the AMD Athlon 64 to the plus 3000 version. From a RAM perspective, they've now upped it to 1.5 gigs of RAM, and for a GPU perspective, they've upped the VRAM now to 256 megs, and you would have needed at least a GeForce 7800 GTX, or from ATI, the Radeon X 1950 XT. Now just to give you a bit of info around that 7800 GTX, there were 2 versions. There was a 256 meg version and a 512 meg version, but the 512 meg version was actually faster than the 256 meg version. It had slightly higher clocks. Now for the beast I managed to assemble. So for the CPU I managed to get a Pentium 4 640 running at 3.2 GHz. I had 2 gigs of RAM running at dual channel at 800 MHz, that's DDR2. And for the GPU I managed to get my hands on the 7800 GTX, but the 512 meg version. So before we jump into the benchmarks, we ran this game at 2 resolutions for the benchmarks. Firstly at 1024 by 768 with the low and high graphics preset, and then at 1280 by 1024, and also at the low and high preset. Just keep in mind, for the high presets we had anti-aliasing at 2 times and anti-stropic filtering at 2 times. With that shit out the way, let's jump into the benchmarks. So now when we stick these 2 benchmarks together, you'll notice that the results are very similar. So this is indicating some type of hardware bottleneck. So what I noticed with this game is it wasn't utilizing both threads of the Pentium 4, it was just fully loading the one thread, which resulted in quite a heavy bottleneck on the GPU. Now for this game specifically, this was quite a well-known issue. If you go and revisit the forums, I did try to disable hyperthreading to see if that would improve the performance, but due to the motherboard I had with very limited BIOS features, I couldn't find anything around hyperthreading or SMTP or anything like that to disable it. But again, this was just a common issue with this game back then. So I thought if I played the game I might as well give it a review. Don't worry, I'm going to keep it short, as I know most of you are here for the hardware. So from a gameplay perspective, I honestly found the controls clunky AF, and the combat was odd at first. You do get used to it though. I did take the keyboard and mouse control combination, which made me feel like Geralt had 2 left feet. So Geralt is the main character you play in the game. But to be honest, this game isn't all about combat and its gameplay. It's all around its storyline and the shit that confused the living hell out of me. What I mean by that is there are a lot of side quests in this game, but the side quests make you feel like it's part of the main story, but then they suddenly just drop shit and then you just end up being more confused in the end, to be honest. That's in my opinion. I also have ADHD, so my attention span is shit short. So outside of that though, the game does have this mechanic where you have to be very specific with the choices you make, because by taking specific choices, it can put the main storyline in different directions. Also, what I found quite interesting in this game, which is a CD Projekt Red type of thing, when you tend to look at what they did with Cyberpunk, is you can get Geralt laid a lot in this game. I heard you can actually sleep with over 20 women in this game, and they actually award you romance cards. So it's actually like a picture of the chick that you slept with, right? And, well, as I say, I just found it rather disturbing, some of those photos or pictures. Sorry, not photos. I'll make it very clear. It's a picture that they award you, right? The romance cards. Outside of that, the game took me a good 30 plus hours to complete. The first 2 chapters were rather boring and slow, so the grind was real, like seriously. But by the time I got to chapter 3 all the way to the last chapter, chapter 5, things definitely did pick up, and that's where I mainly really got interested in the story, to be honest. From a technical perspective, this game didn't really bring anything new. It's just a normal, it was just using DirectX 9 at the time, 9.0C to be specific. From a ratings perspective, I give it between a 5.5 and 6.5 out of 10. You know, if you've never had your virtual cherry popped, I'd say this game is for you. The Witcher 2 was released on the 17th of May 2011 for Windows. I'm going to jump straight into the game system requirements, starting with the minimum requirements. Also, just a note, I don't know what CD Projekt Red were doing at the time, but they really did a half-baked job on these CPU requirements.
Yeah, you know, it ain't always good to get high before you have important things to do.
So, starting with the minimum requirements, let's start with CPUs. So they specify for Intel a Core 2 Duo at 2.2 GHz, notice no models mentioned. And then for AMD, they've said an equivalent AMD processor but at 2.5 GHz, which would have meant for Intel, we're probably talking the Core 2 Duo E4500 or E4600, which would have meant for AMD, we're talking about the AMD Athlon X2 5000 plus, or possibly the 5200 plus. Moving on to system memory, for RAM, you would have needed at least 1 gig for Windows XP and 2 gigs for Windows Vista and Windows 7. Moving over to graphics cards, you would have needed a minimum GPU with 512 megs of VRAM, and that would have put you in the ballpark of either having a GeForce 8800 GTS 512 meg and above, or from AMD, as they had acquired ATI by then, the Radeon HD 3850 512 meg. Also note, there was a 320 meg version of the 8800 GTS. I wonder with some tweaks if that would have been enough VRAM to run this game. Moving over to the recommended system requirements, this is where their CPU requirements really become interesting. For Intel, we have any Intel quad-core, so I don't know what the heck's going on there. And for AMD, any AMD quad-core CPU. So due to the fact that they mentioned the Intel Core 2 Duo series in the minimum requirements here, I'm assuming they're making reference to the Intel Core 2 Quad series of CPUs, which would have meant they would have been, or assuming from an AMD perspective, we're talking then the AMD Venom 2 X4 series. Also keep in mind though, the first Intel Core i series CPUs were out, so for all we know, maybe they're making mention to the Intel Core i5 750 or 760, but I'm pretty sure like the R3 540 or 550 would have run this game. Anyway, let's move on to the RAM. From a RAM perspective, if you're on Windows XP, you would have needed 3 gigs of RAM there, and then 4 gigs for Windows Vista and Windows 7, which meant you would have been running on a 64-bit operating system for Vista and Windows 7. From a GPU perspective, you would have needed at least 1 gig of VRAM, and from NVIDIA, we're talking now the GeForce GTX 260 1 gig. Now, from my understanding, the GTX 260 1 gig was only an OEM GPU, because from my understanding, all the GTX 260s came with 896 megs of RAM. Specifically, the one I have, and the one I originally had back in the day, was the GTX 260 Core 216 version, and that only had 896 megs of GDDR3, I think. From an AMD perspective here, we're talking the Radeon HD 4850. Now, for the system I managed to assemble For the CPU, I had the Intel Core 2 Quad 8300. I also supplied 4 gigs of DDR2 800 RAM running in dual channel, so we're talking two 2 gig modules, and for the GPU, I managed to get my hands on the NVIDIA GTX 260, but the Core 216 edition. Again, running the game on Windows Vista Ultimate 64-bit. Let's now take a look at the benchmarks. I also benchmarked it with the high and low preset at 2 different resolutions. Back in 2011, 1080p was definitely mainstream, but some players hadn't moved over to the widescreen just yet. Well, what we considered widescreen back then. So I also benchmarked it at 1280 by 1024. So let's take a look at the results. Compared to The Witcher 1, The Witcher 2 definitely took advantage of that quad-core CPU and was able to utilize the GTX 260 effectively, which resulted in a way more constant frame rate than The Witcher 1. I did notice though in more populated areas like the cities, the GPU wasn't being fully utilized and there was more load on some of the CPU cores compared to the others. But for the less populated areas, the GPU was being fully utilized most of the time. So, another quick review of this game. As far as the gameplay is concerned, The Witcher 2 compared to the first game has improved in all aspects. You feel like you are actually in control of Geralt. The leveling system is also not confusing, and overall I found it a great experience. For the game itself, the story was easy to follow and it moves quickly, which kept me engaged throughout the whole playthrough. Like seriously, like the game from beginning to end was great. Everything from poisoning, boss fights, invasions, politics, and a fair amount of medallion shaking encounters, if you know what I mean.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Okay, for those who don't know what I mean, I'm talking about here is here. Well, let me not explain it. Here's a sneak preview.
And you two motherfuckers need Jesus.
CD Projekt Red clearly have some issues. But for this game, I gave it an 8 out of 10. Go and play it. Like seriously, go and play it. So The Witcher 3 was released on the 19th of May 2015. It's actually crazy to think this game is already over 10 years old. So it was obviously released for all the platforms then, that being the PlayStation 4, Xbox One and PC. The version we're obviously looking at is the PC version, which are the discs I have here. I do believe it also came out for the Nintendo Switch a few years later. Also keep in mind, before we actually look at the PC requirements, this game originally only supported DirectX 11. We're obviously not looking at the next gen release. You can actually get the DirectX 11 version on Steam, but to do that you got to go to the game properties in Steam, go to the beta section and select the version from the drop down, which is 1.32. This will give you the version, I think it came out in 2018 if I'm correct, which only supported DirectX 11. So let's start looking at the requirements here. So for the minimum CPU requirements, we have a Intel CPU, that being the Core i5 2500K, and the AMD Venom 2 X4940. It required that you had 6 gigs of system RAM, and for the graphics side of things, it required a GTX 660 or an AMD Radeon HD 7870. Now, both these GPUs actually had 2 gigs of VRAM, specifically GDDR5. So, with that out the way, let's take a look at the recommended system requirements for this game. CPU wise, you needed one of the following, either the Intel Core i7 3770 or the AMD FX 8350. From a system RAM perspective, you needed 8 gigs of RAM, and from the GPU side of things, you needed either a GTX 770 or better, or the AMD Radeon R9 290. What I found interesting here though is the GTX 770 only came with 2 gigs of VRAM, but the R9 290 came with 4 gigs of VRAM. Also remember, I think the first 8 gig GPU to hit the mainstream from AMD was the R9 290X, which came with 8 gigs of VRAM for anyone interested. So with that out the way, let's now look at the build I've put together for this game. For the CPU, I hoyed in an AMD FX 8350 at stock clocks. For RAM, I always add a little bit extra, especially for these sort of reviews of games, because we also got to cater for the new operating system. So I actually went with 16 gigs of DDR3 running at 1600 megahertz, and for the GPU I did take it a step up. I took it to the GTX 780 Ti, which came with 3 gigs of VRAM. I thought, well, if they're specifying a 4 gig GPU and a 2 gig GPU, let's take the sweet spot in the middle, just to possibly cover any issues there from a lack of VRAM. So pretty much spot on for the time. The version of the game that I played, which they refer to as the classic version, is the version I've previously mentioned, that being 1.32. Let's now take a look at the benchmarks for this PC build. So with the benchmarks you just saw, we clearly didn't have any issues running this game, no upscaling or nonsense like that, straight up native resolution with decent frame rates. There isn't much to say, the hardware crushed it. Heck, we even managed to run the game at 1440p without any issues. In terms of gameplay, The Witcher 3 offers a much larger aerial open world compared to The Witcher 2, allowing for like more those bloody side quests and more exploration, right? The combat system I felt was smoother, and the controls definitely felt like I was more in control of Geralt, and they also expanded on like a wider variety of skills and abilities, expanding well on what they had done in The Witcher 2. In terms of the story, The Witcher 3 has a bigger and more detailed plot with better, I guess, character development, and the choices really made you sort of think out what you were doing. The Witcher 2, I mean, has a good story, but it feels more linear and less complex. But I guess there are two sides to that, as you definitely have to pay more attention, I would say, in The Witcher 3. I know I did. Overall, The Witcher 3 enhanced the experience, I guess, from a bigger open world, better graphics, so on and so forth. I'm giving it a 7.5 out of 10 for me. Personally, I thought The Witcher 2 was a better game, but again, you can let me know what you think in the comments. I know you guys are going to have a shit fit when I say that, but that's my honest opinion. So let's wrap this one up. From clunky combat in The Witcher 1 to political chaos in The Witcher 2 and epic battles in The Witcher 3. I have to say, playing these games on error-correct hardware was a wild ride. And secondly, if you've made it this far in the video, a big thank you to you. This video took me a while to make, and I'm not an RPG guy at all, and these games are, you got to put a bit of time and dedication to complete them. So again, thank you. Let me go find my 120 hours back of my life, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel, and I will see you on the next one.